Hello, we're doing a DARGchive interview at Umeå University with Dr. Marie Flinkfeldt, who is a Postdoctoral Research Fellow in the Department of Sociology at Umeå University. Thank you very much, Marie, for agreeing to do this interview.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me.
And I'm going to start off with the question that we usually ask our interviewees, which is, how did you get interested in discursive psychology and conversation analysis?
Oh, wow. Yeah, it was a gradual process. And I think, so in the beginning, I was doing an undergraduate degree in sociology at the Department of Sociology in Uppsala, and I was writing my bachelor's thesis and trying to design a project, and I was interested in sick leave and long-term sick leave from work. Just as it was a thing that was debated a lot in like the media at the time, a lot of discussion about that, so I got interested in that. And I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and I ended up doing a grounded theory and doing interviews, which is a very like classical bachelor's thesis. A lot of students do that kind of analysis, and I ended up doing, I ended up being quite puzzled with my interviews actually, because I'd asked very open questions and I wanted to know about like how has your social life changed with the sick leave, and how do people, you know, it just experiences of being on sick leave. And I had a very open, I wasn't very focused in my research questions, but I was trying to, you know, see what they would say and go from there, and that kind of open grounded theory way. And then when I sat down and tried to analyze my interviews, I was really I was a bit frustrated because they hadn't really talked so much about the things that I thought they were going to talk about. And I remember like writing down notes and my reflections on it, and writing down that it feels like they're trying to defend that they're on sick leave or justify that they're on sick leave, as if I were questioning them, which I absolutely hadn't done. So I ended up writing about how they were justifying their sick leave to me as an interviewer. So I think I ended up doing a bit of a discursive psychology analysis, but at the time I had no idea what discursive psychology was. I hadn't done anything like that. I hadn't read anything, so it was all done as a grounded theory. But I was focusing on things that I later on had the tools to actually analyze in a more proper way with discursive psychology and also conversation analysis. So I sort of came across those kinds of questions quite early, but I didn't know what it was. And there was no one who really told me that, oh, but this is actually the kind of analysis that you're doing here is really kind of a discursive psychology analysis. So when I then afterwards was accepted as a PhD student, I was trying to figure out what I was going to do for my project, and trying to design a project to do for, you know, you spend several years on something and you want to do something that you really like and you're very interested in. So I wanted to continue focusing on sick leave in some way, but I wasn't sure how. So I was reading lots of like methodology literature, just in general, very broadly, and I started looking at discourse analysis more generally, because a lot of PhD students were doing that kind of analysis at the time. So I was reading just broadly about different methods, and I remember that I came across a chapter in a book on discourse analysis, and the chapter was focused on discursive psychology, and I read it and I was like, this is what I did for my bachelor's thesis, pretty much. I mean, not in that sophisticated way, and not with those tools and those concepts and all of that, but basically that was the kind of analysis that I had done then, and I just immediately fell in love with it. So from then on, I was just very convinced that I was going to do discursive psychology somehow, and then of course there was a lot of other things, figuring out what is discursive psychology then and all of that, but it was it just kind of hit me at that point, so I was discovering it sort of gradually. Yeah.
So you already mentioned your PhD, which you did at Uppsala University.
Yeah.
And it was focused on kind of managing the legitimacy of sick leave. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the topic of your PhD, your research, the data you were looking at, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so that was also a bit of a gradual process.
Okay.
It was my own project, so I designed it and collected all the data and all of that. I think I spent the whole first year actually trying to figure out what I was going to do, and that's when I discovered discursive psychology. So as I was reading about what is discursive psychology, I realized that, okay, so I want to study interaction somehow, because I got that much, at least in the beginning, that was something that was interesting. So I was trying to figure out, okay, so what sort of interactional arenas are there where sick leave is somehow something that's being discussed or something like that. And I was very interested in different institutional settings in general. I have a background in political science as well, and so I was going to be a bureaucrat from the beginning, and well, we'll see, it might still happen. And then, so I was interested in the Swedish Social Insurance Agency in general, so I was thinking about what sort of data might they have. And then I ended up collecting recordings of meetings between people on sickness benefit, their case officers at the Social Insurance Agency, and their doctors, and then sometimes there were other people as well, so up to maybe 5 people in a meeting. And to see how did they manage the legitimacy of the sick leave in that institutional setting, and what sort of issues were at stake there. And I think that just trying to in my approach to that, I was very much informed by that debate in society as well, where a lot of people who were on sick leave at the time said in interview studies as well that, well, I feel like it's not okay to be on sick leave. I feel like I have to defend myself all the time. And I think that's also what I came across in my bachelor's thesis, that kind of narratives, but in an interview setting. So I wanted to see, okay, so if they say that, what does that look like in those situations where it's really, really important to pass as legitimately on sick leave, because if you don't, you might lose all your benefits. So it's a lot at stake there. So I wanted to see, so how do they go about that? Is that an issue there? And how can we see that in the interaction? So that's what I focused on. But then there was this other side of my PhD as well, because it took me a long time to gain access and to get that data. So what I did in the meantime was that I started looking at internet forums and people on long-term sick leave discussing their sick leave and discussing lots of different things, and basically hanging out in this forum thread that I studied, and spending all their day there basically, and getting to know each other and all of that. So half my thesis was that institutional setting, and half was the online interaction between, roughly, I would say, women on long-term sick leave who had been on sick leave for many years, and we're just hanging out in this forum and talking about their everyday life. What am I doing now? Things like talking about the housework that they did during the day, or waiting for kids to come home from school, or I'm going to go to the doctors now, or just everyday stuff, and analyzing that. So there's two parts to that, to the PhD, which I think allowed me to see as well that there are similar issues at stake, even though it's so clear in the institutional setting that it's going to be an issue. But in an online setting where they're anonymous to each other, or were in the beginning at least, there shouldn't be so much at stake there. No one knows who they are. It's not like they could lose their benefits if they don't pass as legitimately on sick leave, but I could see that they still manage those issues in quite similar ways, actually. So, yeah.
Wow, that's really interesting. And you already said that your PhD had these 2 components. So after you finished that project, you've gone on to look at other kind of topics to do with sort of social policy, social issues?
Yeah. So I was very lucky that just before I defended my PhD, I received a grant from the Swedish Social Insurance Agency to look at, to collect some new data. So I've been working with that kind of data since I defended in 2016. So in that project, I've been looking at calls to the customer service at the Swedish Social Insurance Agency, and both, well, in the general organization of those calls, of course, but I had a focus on financial hardship and families with children, which was what, and basically because the call was about that. So that's why the project was sort of designed to fit in with what they wanted in a sense, but recording lots of different phone calls and looking at both how is financial hardship raised in these calls, and what is it used to do from the caller's point of view, and then also how is it responded to by the call takers. So what can they do, because it's a very sensitive topic. It doesn't, institutionally, it doesn't really fit well with what the Social Insurance Agency is doing, because it's a very rule-governed, bureaucratic organization. It doesn't, for the most part, matter very much whether you're in very much need of money, because for the most part, it doesn't affect your eligibility for different benefits. So in a sense, it's a very difficult thing for call takers to deal with. So I've been looking at that and see the different strategies that call takers use to deal with that kind of sensitive topics, and also some other things that relate to that. Yeah. All right.
And now you have a new project that you're working on?
Yeah. So I've continued to work with the data that I collected, the phone calls, and I felt that if I'm going to collect data, I might just as well collect quite a lot of data, and then I can keep working with that. Yeah, it's very convenient in many ways. So now I've got a new project that is using calls specifically about parental leave and parental benefits in Sweden. And I'm looking at those for at least partly from a gender equality point of view. So I'm interested in the sort of situated responsibility of mothers and fathers in calling the social insurance agencies. So like taking responsibility for planning, for finding out information, for administering certain details in the insurance and things like that, and also to what extent do you take responsibility for calling on behalf of your partner, for instance. So it's a very practical way of getting at gender equality in relation to parenting, which I think is sort of uncovering a bit of the black box that's rarely studied. So for the most part, it's the outcomes that are studied, like what's the uptake, what's the use of parental leave, statistically looking at that, and how can that be related to different types of background factors, whereas the processes and what happens as you search for information, for instance, if you call to ask questions, or it hasn't been studied. So we don't know if there is, if moms and dads are actually treated equally when they call the social insurance agency. So that's also part of the project to see, is there any difference in what sort of help you get, how call takers respond to questions, how much service they give or how they give that service, and also is gender at all raised as a topic or in other ways occasion in these calls. So that's what I'm looking at, yeah. So I'm very excited about that.
Yeah, these are very fascinating and important questions.
Thank you.
So many, if not all, of the projects that you worked on after you finished your PhD were funded through grants that you yourself wrote and won, basically. So that puts you in a good position to talk a little bit about the process of successfully applying for money for kind of applied research, applied CA research projects. I was wondering if we could talk about.
Yeah, sure. And I think, I mean, I've been really lucky in so many ways, because it's a very nice position to be in when you finish and you're able to work on your own projects, and also you're very free with your time and you can do lots of different things, and to just be able to study the things that you're interested in. So I'm just really happy that I've gotten that opportunity. And I think it's an important thing to talk about as well, because I see so much potential for applied CA studies that I think, I mean, just speaking from an early career researcher point of view, and also someone doing applied CA and DP, I think it's not necessarily a very difficult sell, actually. And there's so much potential for doing that kind of research that I think it's an important thing to talk about more, because I think there are certain keys and how you go about to get those grants. Yeah. So I think, so one, just to mention a few things. So so I think it's important to start with the project first, rather than the call or the application. So I think sometimes it's a bit problematic that there's it seems like sometimes when people talk about writing grants proposals, it's done in a bit of a derogatory way. Like, people want to get the grants, but at the same time, it's kind of like, well, you know, it's a bit of a sellout. It's about money. You don't want to talk about money, things like that. And it's sometimes it's framed as if it's a skill that has more to do with writing than with research. And of course, it is a skill in a sense, but it's also a research skill in designing a project. So it's, I would say, it's more about research design than it is about writing a text well. And of course, you have to do both. But I think it's important to emphasize that, that it's about research design. And I think it also means that for applied CA studies, there's so much potential there, because it's quite easy to show that in a particular area of application, in a particular institutional setting, for instance, not much has been done with a CA approach. And I think that's true for so many settings. I mean, there's quite a lot in medicine, there's quite a lot in like different educational settings, things like that. But apart from that, a lot of it's an under-researched matter, just interaction in different institutional settings. So I think it's quite, I wouldn't say, I don't want to use the word easy, because of course it's not easy. But I think if you design a project well to sort of speak to that research gap, it can be really convincing. So I think CA studies in that sense can be very convincing. And I think also with the kind of sort of outreach work that some researchers have done, and particularly like Liz Doko, for instance, in showing how that kind of research results can be put to use in organizations. And how it can actually promote change in different ways and be really useful. I think that's also a very good selling point. So I think if you manage to design a project that speaks to that as well, I think that can be a good way to get grants, actually.
All right.
Yeah, and then so a few other things that just have to do with how you sort of write up the grant. I think an important thing is to think that your project should be important rather than interesting. And I think sometimes that distinction isn't always clear. Like, we get excited about things because we look at data and there's interesting things in there, and it's like, ooh, but that's fascinating. But is it important? It's important for us, maybe. But would somebody else outside of CA circles think that it's important? I think not necessarily. So I think that's important to bear in mind as well. So there are like 3 questions that you could ask yourself. So why this, which speaks to like, is there a research gap? Is there a need for this knowledge somehow? And why me? Why am I particularly suited to do this project? Ideally, I'm better suited than anybody else given the experience that I have, because you always have some expertise that nobody else really has, or combination of expertise. And then why now? Is there a particular reason that right now it's necessary, it's absolutely necessary to do this project at this time? So there could be in institutional settings, it could be a change in regulation, it could be that an organization has adopted a new technology, for instance, or something that means that, ooh, we have to hurry up and do this now because this is the ideal time. And I think it just makes it really convincing if you do that. And then I think, so I mentioned that the projects that I'm doing now is based on data that I collected previously. So I think that's also a good thing, if you can do that, to think about collecting data that you can reuse, because it means that you already have something some data, even if you might want to collect other data as well for if you apply for a new grant, but still you have some of the data there, which lowers the risk of the project and means that you can convincingly say, well, you know, I already see some of this in my data, so I know that there's going to be interesting things here. So it provides you with a really good argument, I think. And then the final point is that to team up with other people.
Right.
And I think that there's a general trend, and of course, in a sense, this is speaking also from a Swedish perspective, but I think it goes for other countries as well and their funding, that there's a trend towards bigger projects with larger teams. And when I say team up, I don't necessarily mean with other CA people. I mean, you can do that, but a lot of the time that might mean that you have more of the same. So everybody has kind of the same, maybe not, you wouldn't think so, but other people who don't come from a CA environment think that, well, if they're all CA people, why do they need to team up? Because they're not really contributing something unique to the project. So to think about that in a larger project, you can have a CA component, and then there might be someone doing an ethnographic study or interviews, and there might be someone doing a survey, for instance. And then you can really argue, well, what does each person bring to the table, to the project? And why is each component necessary? So I think that's also something you can think about. And I think in a lot of bigger projects, there could be a CA component because it's really, it's contributing something that other methodologies don't. So I think that, yeah, it's worth to think about that.
Well, the immediate question that comes to mind when you say about having a CA component, I'm wondering whether you would imagine there would be kind of any tension, or would there be more compatibility between CA and approaches which are more like sort of traditional in the sense of like surveys or interviews, and especially with DP that has moved away from interviews at the moment. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it can be tricky, and I think it's important to sort of keep an open mind to the other approaches that other people might have. I have teamed up with other people, but I haven't actually engaged in like an interview study or something like that myself. But so our next project that I'm doing with a colleague who has, so it's also funded by the Social Insurance Agency. It starts in January, so we haven't actually started doing it yet. But it's using my data, and it's a kind of a applied CA study, but it also builds on interviews that she has done in a previous project where she has talked to case officers saying that it's really difficult to ask parents about violence, and talking to parents about violence, which is a task that they have to do somehow. And then, so we said that, well, in these data that I have, we can actually see how the case officers do that.
Wow.
So it's not so much asking, so what do you think about things, and going into the details of their, of the interview narratives, but rather using that as a starting point for, okay, so that might be something that we want to look at, and to see, do we see those difficulties in the data, the problems that they talk about, do we find some sort of solution to that? So I think that's also a way to do that, and I think it's important to keep in mind that you don't have to necessarily be the one, you don't have to do the survey or the interviews, and someone else can do that. But just to see that you're bringing different perspectives, and you're looking at a problem, for instance, from different points of use, and I just think it's of course you have to be careful and not to think about like how the different approaches complement each other, rather than why one is better than the other, and sometimes that can be hard. So, but if you find good people and start with the design of the project as well, it can make a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And now that we're talking about kind of CA's relationships with other methodologies, was wondering if you could reflect a little bit, because you have a background in sociology, if you could reflect about what do you think CA's role is in sociology, CA's contribution? to sociology?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, CA is already sociology, so originating in sociology and also ethnomethodology, which is kind of also, it's also sociology already. So I think, I mean, it's important to sort of keep that in mind as well. Like sometimes if you talk about it in a certain way, it sort of seems like it's something coming from outside and then being brought into sociology and bringing in something new, which isn't really the case. So I think that's important, but I think it can also bring a lot of insight that a lot of traditional approaches don't really do. So I guess, I mean, just uncovering the fine-grained machinery of how things work in general. I mean, there are many sociological approaches, or most sociological approaches, other approaches than ethnomethodology and CA and also discursive psychology sort of gloss over that or don't look at that and don't see it, like studying outcomes and some factors far behind, but not looking at that black box of what happens in between. So I think sort of uncovering the details of how society works on a fine-grained level, it's important for the understanding of a lot of different institutions, social problems, and yeah, just in general. So I think it really does contribute a lot to developing sociology and sociological knowledge.
Yeah. So another question that we usually ask our interviewees has to do with sort of their kind of career and their discovery and their development as kind of discourse psychologists and conversationalists, and many have a sort of moment or several moments where they come across a paper that is inspiring, or they have they view a presentation that inspires them and kind of makes things click in a different way. I was wondering if you had some of those moments. If you want to talk about them.
Yeah, so I think the most crucial moment for me was probably reading that book chapter in the beginning when I was trying to figure out what I was going to do and just immediately falling in love. And I mean, I remember that I was on my balcony and it was sunny and I was drinking water. So it's a kind of, it sounds very geeky in a sense, but it's like remembering where you were at some point where something really big happened. So I think that is that to me, and it's not because it was a great chapter necessarily. I mean, it was just a basic book. It's used in teaching a lot, and it's actually a bit problematic because it doesn't cover a lot of the like later developments of discursive psychology. So I mean, but it just spoke to me. So I think I remember that very well, and it was an important thing for me for just discovering discursive psychology, and then eventually more and more CA as well through that. Yeah.
So the moment, do you have like a favorite chapter or a favorite book or a favorite quote or a favorite author?
Yeah, so I think the one paper that I think I end up citing it in almost everything I write is Derek Edwards' Moaning, Winching and Laughing, which I just keep coming back to. And I think for me it opened up the idea that what we do in action is very closely related to who we are and the identity work that we do. And so I think that was very inspiring, and I keep coming back to it. I think it's really good to use. I use it in my teaching as well, as if I only can. So and try to spread it as much as possible. So yeah. And then also actually, but that was much later. But Liz Doko's TED Talk has been really, really good. I mean, it was good. It's always good. I mean, I really enjoy her work a lot, so it was good for me, but it's been very useful in the sense that I can show it to other people. So I think I showed it to my dad, and that was the first time that he sort of got what it is that I actually do. So I think that has been very important for me as well, but on another level, just for explaining to people who don't do that kind of stuff, what is it and what's the use of this? Yeah.
So we're now at Loughborough, where you are a visiting research fellow.
Yeah.
But this is not your first time in Loughborough, and you actually have a bit of a tradition of coming here. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your kind of connection to Loughborough over the years?
Yeah, so I come here as much as I can. So the first time it was actually after I'd sort of fallen in love with discursive psychology, but I still didn't really know what discursive psychology was, and I was trying to read, and as much as I could, but of course when you're in a place where no one else is really doing that kind of work, it's difficult. So I was taking a course in discourse analysis in general, and the teacher of the course had done something in the field of discursive psychology before, and I talked to him, and he said, well, you know, if you're interested in discursive psychology, you should go to Loughborough, and you should email the Stoco, and you should say hi from me and say that you want to come and visit. So I did that, and I hardly knew anything about discursive psychology, but just wanted to be near it and be in an environment where it was okay to do discursive psychology, because it wasn't quite clear. I mean, I come from a department which is very open to students and PhD students designing their own projects, so I was always free to do what I wanted to do, but no one else was really doing that kind of work, and I couldn't really get much help. And I think it's just really, really important to be in an environment where it's not only okay, but it's also encouraged, and you can get help and guidance and all of that. I mean, I came to Loughborough, I think that must have been in 2008 or 2009, something like that. And that was the first data session I ever had. And it was just amazing to be surrounded by the stuff that I'd only read about. And so I learned a lot. And then I've been back a few times, and I'm here for this semester, and this is the longest I've been here. But it's just a treat, I think, to come here, because it's really quite unique. So, yeah.
And then my final question is sort of stepping outside academia. I was wondering if you still have time, while juggling all the projects and all your interests, you still have time for hobbies or kind of leisure time activities?
Oh, I think you need to, otherwise you'd go crazy. But yeah, so I do. I have quite a big garden. I grow my own vegetables.
Ooh.
So that's it, and it's also very good because it's a seasonal activity, so you take a rest from it as well in the winter. But yeah, that's been a hobby like the last 2 years maybe. I got really into that, so growing pumpkins and carrots and salad and like all the different veggies, and then also cooking it, which is also another area that I just really love as well. So just a bit of a foodie, and I like cooking, but I also really enjoy going out to restaurants, and yeah.
So what's like your favorite recipe?
Oh,
what would you cook with your, with your own grown vegetables?
I mean, I cook lots of things. I mean, almost anything. I mean, the thing when you have things in your garden is you don't start with the recipe. You start with what you have. So it's like a data-driven process in a sense. You look at what you have in your garden, what's ripe now, and like, ooh, we have so much lettuce, we need to do something with this, and then you make a salad. Or wow, we just harvested all these pumpkins, let's make pumpkin soup. So yeah, I mean, I guess that relates to that process of how you do analysis as well. So starting with what you have, look at the data and then go from there.
Okie dokie.
Right.
This was a wonderful interview. Thank you very much, Marie.
Thank you so much, Bogdana. It's a pleasure.